Hi, I'm Larry Castle here with Ken Brown for episode 70 of That's a Good Question. What's the latest with Durham, the election, and the 1-6 Commission? Well, welcome. Today we are going to discuss some recent events, and we're going to use as our starting point the question, what's the latest with Durham, the election, and the 1-6 Commission? And so that's kind of some topics we've been discussing here and there over the last many months. And a few months ago, we said that we would be devoting episodes sometimes or even often to biblical perspective on current events, because we want our church members and all of you who are viewing, but especially our church members, to have a proper view of what's going on around them, a biblical perspective on it. And really, we believe that the principles of the Bible, things that we learn from Scripture, apply to everything. And so it's important that we help people see that. And so let's actually start by reminding ourselves what the Scripture teaches regarding this concept, that it's relevant to everything.
Well, we sometimes talk about the sufficiency of Scripture, which says that the Bible addresses all matters, either directly or indirectly. In fact, the most well-known passage in the Bible about the Bible, 2 Timothy 3:16, says that all Scripture is God-breathed. That is, it's from God, and it's useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. But then it gives the purpose for all of that. It's useful for those four things: teaching, rebuking, correcting, training. But here's the reason: so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work.
And growing up, it was very easy for me to not even notice the end of that. You know, you would hear taught frequently those key concepts
That's right.
about the ways you use the Bible or implement it.
And if you leave that off, those things become the end. They become the end for what the Bible is given for. It's given for teaching as an end in itself. It's given for rebuking. It's given for... No, all of that is so that we can serve God properly. We can live life properly. And it says every good work. But the Bible does not address everything directly. But often it's indirectly through principles that can be applied to our situations. So the range of subject matter to which the Bible may be applied is really unlimited. Cornelius Van Til, that's a late theologian that some of us are familiar with, had to become familiar with in Bible college and seminary, but a brilliant guy. And he said there's a sense in which Scripture speaks of everything. And he went on to say this: we do not mean that it speaks of football games or atoms, etc., directly, but we do mean it speaks of everything either directly or indirectly. It tells us not only of the Christ and his work, but it also tells us who God is and whence the universe has come. It gives us a philosophy of history as well as history. Moreover, the information on these subjects is woven into an inextricable whole. It is only if you reject the Bible as the Word of God that you can separate its so-called religious and moral instruction, things just for Sunday and Sunday school, from what it says about things like the physical universe. So that's Van Til commenting on this idea that the Bible addresses everything, either in precept or principle, directly or indirectly, including, of course, current events.
Yeah. And one of the biblical issues that we've been concerned about, talking about biblical principle, is that, and it affects some of what we see happening here in the last few years.
Yes.
The topic is that of structure.
Yeah.
And specifically chipping away at structure, for example, in our country's institutions.
Yeah.
Because the Bible warns of that danger.
It does. Right? It does indeed.
I mean, it doesn't name America again, but it warns of chipping away at institutions and structure.
It does indeed, yeah. Psalm 11 in verse 3 says, when the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? when the foundations are destroyed. And that's what we're talking about here with the structure and the chipping away at the structure, you say. So the Expositor's Bible Commentary says that foundations in that passage refers to the order of society, to the established institutions, the social and civil order of the community. So when we Christians who believe that those things being things like family and things like community and things like government, these are foundational, structural things. When we see those being attacked, then we should be concerned. We should do what we can to warn against further erosion of those things, including, like I said, family, government, society as a whole, the institutional church as well. So, with regard to government and its responsibility to ensure that justice is served, when we see that not happening, that's a chipping away. And that brings us to what you said in the title then. What happened with Durham this week?
Yeah. I'll remind our listeners that 2 months ago we talked about John Durham and his investigation into the origins of the Russia investigation and the Trump campaign a few years ago. In fact, Durham's been investigating that for over 2 years now.
Yes.
And a couple months ago then we talked about the indictment of some.
Yeah.
And we talked about, I'm sure we need to do a quick refresher on who he is and what he's looking into for folks.
Right. He came up a couple months ago, because he indicted someone who lied to investigators during his investigation. So who is he? Well, he was appointed by the Attorney General under President Trump to be what's called a special counsel. That is someone who's specifically focused in on looking into a particular matter, and then he's supposed to report back on that matter. Now, that matter is, as you said, the origin of the investigation that the FBI undertook before the 2016 presidential election, and whether or not that investigation was proper to even get into.
That can be tricky, understanding what we're talking about there, because he's investigating the source of an investigation.
That's exactly right. The origin of the investigation.
Okay.
So he's been looking into that for over two years. And until just recently, he had really come up with very little directly to what it is he's investigating. But this past week, he came up with something important and actually troubling that we'll talk about in just a bit. But first, this issue of whether the FBI should have ever looked into the Russians and their attempts to influence the Trump campaign, that's an issue that has already been looked into thoroughly by the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice is what they call Inspector General. Every department in the federal government, Department of Labor, Department of Agriculture, Department of the Interior, all the departments, Department of Treasury, Department of Justice, they all have someone appointed called the Inspector General for that area. And we actually have an inspector whistleblower law that involves the Inspector General, so that if someone sees something going wrong in the federal government, in their department, an employee, they don't have to sweep it under the rug for fear of reprisal. They actually have a process that they can go through. And then this Inspector General can, on the QT, look into this and then decide, I'm really going to make this investigation because it's worthwhile. So I personally think it's a very good thing that we have.
Seems like a good protection.
Yes.
One of those things that you were talking about earlier, a structure in place, and
exactly.
We're conservative.
Yeah.
One of those things we want to conserve, as you've talked about in the past. You don't want
right.
to lightly do away with a structure like that or undermine it.
And as we're going to see a theme today in our session is that unfortunately we become so politicized that now whether or not things like the Inspector General, and I wasn't going to talk specifically about that, but it's another example of how we're partisan in the way we see that work. I want to mention some other things where whether we think it's a good thing depends on who's being harmed by it, who's being taken to task by it. Well, unfortunately, the Inspector General has degenerated into that because they do their work. I think it's a very good thing. I think it's a very good law. But the Inspector General, especially the one for the Department of Justice, has been denounced by Republicans because he looked into some of the things that they were sure were at that were in error that he should have determined. Well, his investigation didn't find what they wanted, and so they denounced him. So this idea of whether there should have been a Russian investigation to begin with has already been looked into by the Inspector General for the Department of Justice. And he concluded that the investigation was, and this is the phrase he used, properly predicated. That is, there was good reason to look into it because there was evidence that, in fact, Russia was trying to influence our election through the Trump campaign, actually wanting Trump to win. So he comes to that conclusion. The Attorney General, though, at the time, William Barr, didn't like that answer. So he appointed his own guy, Durham, enter John Durham, to do his own investigation, a special counsel to look into this really again. Now, what he came up with, though, this past week is interesting because he indicted a Russian who was feeding information to a guy named Christopher Steele. And Steele put it in a report, and he gave that report to the FBI.
Okay, so the Russian is giving him information to another guy, Steele,
Yeah.
and he gives the information to the FBI.
Yeah.
So can you explain then what's the problem? What's the problem with that?
Well, there's a few things. Steele was hired by a firm that was working with, all right, wait for it, the Hillary Clinton campaign.
Ah,
And the Russian guy who was feeding him information was himself getting information from somebody in the Clinton campaign.
okay.
So you have the Clinton campaign trying to exploit the many contacts that the Trump people had with Russians by feeding that to the FBI.
Okay. I mean, I can see someone sitting and listening to this. All right, this just sounds like politics, right? You got one side digging up dirt on their opponent
Yeah.
and flinging it out in the public.
True. That's true. And that is what goes on, unfortunately, in politics. So you could just leave it at that and say that's a dirty game. But when Durham has asked this Russian with whom he was working and where he was getting his information, he lied about it multiple times. He lied to federal investigators because he did not want what they were up to being uncovered. So the Russian has been indicted on 5 counts of lying to investigators about what he was doing, in particular who he was doing it with.
I see. So does that mean that there never should have been a Mueller investigation in the first place into the ties between Trump campaign and the Russians? So if you're watching at home, just as a reminder, Mueller was also special counsel,
Right.
and he spent just under 2 years looking into connections between Trump campaign
Right.
and the Russians. And we talked about this. He found a boatload.
Right.
You know, we talked about in one of our episodes how many Trump campaign officials were not only indicted but convicted
Correct.
of lying, of obstruction, and also several Russians as well.
Yep.
But you know, the Trump people, they got their pardons.
Yep.
Because the president, in exchange for cooperation,
Yeah.
maybe I'm reading in a little there, but the Russians didn't need to cooperate with Mueller since Trump wasn't going to be handing out pardons to them, right?
Well, the Russians, couldn't be they weren't going to be extradited. Russia wasn't going to send them over here to face trial anyway. So they're indicted, but they're over in Russia. But
didn't need a pardon.
Here didn't need a pardon.
Yeah.
But you got these Americans who needed them. And in the Mueller report itself, Mueller says that this interfered with our investigation, the fact that Trump was dangling pardons and giving pardons to these people.
So the question then is, would there have ever been a Mueller investigation if no one knew that these people were working for the Clinton campaign and digging up dirt?
Well, that too. It's an excellent question. It's the right one. Anybody that's still listening to us.
We lost him when we said
asking
investigation of an investigation.
Probably so. But that question, whether should there have been an investigation at all, and would there have been an investigation if it wasn't for this information that Christopher Steele got from this Russian who was lying about where and was associated with the Clinton campaign. That's already been looked into, and he concluded there would have been.
Okay.
An FBI investigation, and should have been, even without the report that Christopher Steele produced. And that report has been called for years now the Steele dossier, the Steele dossier.
Sounds
fancy
like
name for a report.
007 movie.
Yes, exactly. Because the FBI had been given information about Trump campaign ties to Russia before, and this is really important, before the Steele dossier. And if they didn't have the Steele dossier, you still had this issue. And Mueller did not use the Steele dossier in his investigation. President Trump got great mileage, and he still does, by calling everything that's bad for him a witch hunt. We've all heard that over and over again. But with the FBI and Mueller investigations, unfortunately for former President Trump, there were lots of witches to hunt. and many of those witches were actually caught, but most were also pardoned, and they wouldn't cooperate. Now, it is true that the Steele dossier had very serious claims in it, and it had some even salacious claims in it that I can't even mention on this air about Trump himself. And that, of course, that kind of thing got a lot of media coverage. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, the dossier was important, and the FBI used it. It was important because that got people's attention. Mm. And that was out there in the media a lot, that the Steele dossier says, this happened, that happened. And there was credibility given to it at the time in the media. And here's another thing. The FBI did use the Steele dossier in one respect, and that was to get warrants. They had to go to court to get warrants on a guy named Carter Page, who was working in the Trump campaign. He had extensive contacts with the Russians. They were suspicious, the FBI was. They wanted to surveil what was going on there, and they used claims in the Steele dossier to get warrants on him. And the Inspector General looked into that too, and he faulted the FBI for using the Steele information at all. But Mueller did not. Mueller did not. In fact, Carter Page was never indicted, let alone convicted, but dozens were convicted, and the Steele dossier had nothing to do with those convictions that Mueller was able to get.
So I recall that many of those who were convicted, they were charged with lying to investigators. We've talked about this. So, for example, Michael Flynn lied to the FBI. He was convicted, but he also becomes a martyr to many people because they claim that he was mistreated. The FBI tricked him into lying.
Yes, that's the claim. Multiple people lied to investigators, but the claim is they were tricked. And in any case, lying is just what I learned this phrase through all of this, It's just a process crime.
Yeah, I remember you bringing that up, process crime. That was an interesting discussion we had in a previous episode.
Right.
So this Russian guy now who lied to Durham's investigators, then if we're being consistent, right?
Yes.
It's no big deal.
Right.
He's guilty of a process crime.
And there's the problem, right?
Yeah.
Because our view of justice, as I said earlier, friends, cannot be seen through a political lens.
Otherwise, we're chipping the foundation out from under our own feet.
And the Bible warns against that. Okay, that's why we care about it. It cannot be that when the guys on my team do it, it's just a process crime. But when the other team does it, it's the unpardonable sin.
Right.
And that's what you're going to have right now. So you just mark my words right now.
We don't have, this is a nonprofit organization.
I am prophesying right now that this just came out, and in the weeks and the months ahead, conservative media is going to blow up, blow up with the fact that Durham has got this guy lying and to cover up his connection to the dossier and the Clinton campaign. Now, that's a story in its own right. That's the politics and what they were trying to do and all of that. But again, that does not affect what Mueller found in courts of law that you can read. It's a 500-page report. I keep telling people to do that. So this lack of even-handedness is really a problem. Yet this is the way so many people look at things, rather than looking at it from a biblical perspective. And the fact that God frequently condemns in Scripture the perversion of justice. Because it's so dangerous to a society. Even Christian people have now sunk to a depth that minimizes lying under oath, if you can believe that as, no big deal.
In contrast to, I remember growing up, the big deal we made about Bill Clinton lying under oath.
I mean, he should be impeached, removed from office, drawn and quartered. Oh, yeah, all of that, right.
Yeah.
So What we should do instead is condemn every single undermining of the justice system. And honesty is a requirement of any system of justice. And that's why we make a big deal in the justice system, as well we should, of taking a solemn oath that you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. That's why Jesus said that your word should be so good that you actually don't need an oath. We are people of truth, and we should speak it no matter who needs to hear it. And we should condemn falsehood no matter who commits it. But you have lots of people who have no integrity right now, frankly, online to the FBI with this new Durham indictment, because they've spent years saying it's no big deal when it was people on their team doing it. For my part, I hope that Durham uncovers every single person who has lied or engaged in any wrongdoing, because justice is foundational for our society, and without it, our system cannot stand.
Yeah. So no institution, not even the church, can be maintained without structural integrity, is what we're saying.
Right.
And we talk often about, you and I have decisions to make
our
around
work.
here.
That's right.
We talk about a particular decision, how it will not just, what do we think about this decision, but how will it affect ministry overall? How will it affect the structure of what we do?
And that's the difference between leading something where you have to look at it from a vantage point that is perched at the top, as we have to lead, as we lead a church, and we have that privilege. But that means you have, if you want to use an org chart, that means you have a vantage point that sees more of the field. You see more of the structure. And you have folks serving faithfully in pieces of the structure.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't necessarily see everything and how that fits together. I mean, that's fine. People are in leadership to do that very thing. But we have to then take into consideration how one decision we make over here and how it affects everything else. That's what we mean by the structural integrity. And if you start chipping away, in one area of those things that undergird society, now you are playing a very, very dangerous game. We are playing politics with justice, and we're undermining then a key gift of God's common grace to us.
Yeah, very important. Well said. Good way to say that. So the justice system's not only, it's not the only area, I should say, where this is happening. It's also happening, and one of the other topics we raise in the title of today's episode, the electoral process. Court after court has rejected the claims of a stolen election last year.
Right.
Some of the attorneys who have gone, who made these claims have gone to court, and they have had their law licenses suspended, like Giuliani.
Yep.
Just 2 days ago, none other than Sydney released the Kraken Powell.
Oh boy.
Was before a committee of the Texas bar to take responsibility for her actions and all of this, and she might get disciplined as well. So state after state, they've done recounts, audits, including here in Michigan, but still no proof of a stolen election.
Right.
So now we have Republicans, a state legislature passing laws to make elections more secure, even though there's not really any proof that they were insecure.
Right.
But related to all that, then, we had elections in some states this past week. And oddly enough, I haven't heard any claims of fraud. Have you?
That's something, and that was days ago. That was Tuesday, right?
Yeah,
it was
just
election
like crickets on that.
Crickets, right? Well, Republicans did pretty well in those elections. So what's to complain about?
Gotcha.
So here's another deal where you complain about it one way, but you don't complain about it another way. Like with
to listen a couple months ago, you'd think there's no hope of having a fair election in America.
No. So you see what we mean by fair then. We mean by fair how it comes out. Yeah. So just like the lying to federal investigators, it appears it only matters if you're on the losing end. So consider the presidential election last year. Biden wins 51% to 47%. Trump loses 47 to 51, 4 percentage points. That's actually a pretty healthy margin of victory. It's certainly not a razor thin victory. But it was so close that it required all the protests and all the court cases, and all the new laws that we've seen. Now, I understand that some states were indeed quite close. But this past Tuesday's gubernatorial election in Virginia, which everybody was watching, the Republican wins 51 to 48. to 48. So he wins by a little bit less than Biden won by. Biden won by a bit more, right? And no one says anything about the need for a recount or for a stolen election.
Yeah. I shared with you and the other pastors here today a message by a guy from Laga Software, Mark Ward. He talks about this kind of thing related to what you're saying in that message about trying to represent your opponent in its best light.
Yes.
Trying to identify the strongest points of the opposition so that you have credibility then when you do disagree.
Yes, that's right. And, and we're trying to do that. I don't claim I always succeed, and I'm happy to be called out when I don't. But you're right, and Mark Ward is right, that is what we need to do, that our own integrity requires that. So when we go through these things, I do try to say, hey, Durham found things, okay?
Yeah.
And those things ought to be prosecuted. And so I want to be able to say, I don't care on which side it happens. Somebody lies. If it's Bill Clinton lying, then to investigators, then he ought to be held accountable, and everybody else ought to.
Yeah,
as well.
and for our part, here as two conservatives,
Yeah.
we take special attention when there's an inconsistency there on the part of
Yes.
our side, because we're trying to do that, trying to take responsibility, trying to be credible.
And we of all people, sorry to interrupt, but we of all people ought to do that for what you said earlier. That's what conservative means. You're trying to conserve the institutions.
Exactly, yeah. So these results then in the gubernatorial election from Tuesday, what do they mean for the next, the elections next year, maybe 2024?
Yeah. Probably not a whole lot, but the chattering class needs something to talk about, and so
Is that the news? Is that the news anchors, the chattering class?
they've got to come up with something, and so this is a great thing for them to talk about and try to make connections to, and all of that. So they always make these elections that happen in the first year of a presidency.
Yeah.
And let me just stop and think about the first year of a presidency elections. Those are actually quite unusual because as you all know, the presidential elections take place in an even numbered year. So the next year is going to be an odd numbered year, and you've got some states that are odd enough to have elections for their state in an odd numbered year. But there's only just a few of those, and Virginia happens to be one of them. So this happens with Virginia like every 4 years. Okay. That after there's been a presidential election, the next year there's going to be a gubernatorial election in Virginia. Pennsylvania happens to be one as well, but there's only a handful of these that are like that. Everybody else, Michigan, our next run for governor is going to be in 22, not in 21, and pretty much for everybody else as well. So the reason I bring that up is though, there's history. Virginia, you can just look back at their history. We see this happen all the time. You have somebody elected president, and then the following year, you have somebody elected governor of Virginia. And Virginia almost never reelects a governor from the same party. Almost never. The outgoing governor was a Democrat. And so there was every reason to believe that they would elect a Republican, as long as they ran a decent Republican candidate. And it appears they did. I've learned some more about Glenn Youngkin, but I did not know him prior to all of this. But by all accounts, he was an excellent candidate. But it doesn't say much about what's going to happen in the future, since Virginia always goes back and forth. Now, one thing about his election, though, is that, interestingly, he actively resisted having Trump come to campaign for him.
I think I remember hearing about this.
Yes,
yeah.
and he thought that would hurt, not help his chances. And that was undoubtedly true in a state that is, we call it a purple state instead of a red, or a blue, Democrat, blue, red, Republican. It's kind of in between. It goes back and forth.
Yeah.
So
I wouldn't say it's trending yet, but I have noticed an uptick in the number of times I see people, I forget what the hashtag was, but commenting that resisting Trump's support is becoming more commonplace than calling for it, or inviting it.
Now, in Alabama, it won't be.
Right.
Because it's deep red. And so Trump will be in Alabama, and he'll be in other places like that. But in purple places, like Arizona, which was very close, and you got that all contested, right? Michigan was very close. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, those are places that could go either way in the next presidential election. So it appears, and this is just my 2 cents, the best thing Republican candidates can do in those kinds of places would be to resist having Trump come. But it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Seems like that would have other good side effects as well, then, because now there's not as much sway to be had.
Well, and just to lay it out there again, as I have done at our church for about 5 years, to just say, look, that putting Trump to the side should have happened in 2016. He should have never gotten the nomination. He had, and then he does, and then he gets elected amazingly. But he had, when he got elected, both houses of Congress. 4 years later, he had, and the Republicans have neither. Now, next year, there's every reason to believe Republicans are going to retake both. Because on average, in the House of Representatives, the party that is in the White House loses 28 seats, and the Democrats only have something like a 6-seat majority right now. That's why they're having such a difficult time getting these bills, these spending bills passed, because they have a razor thin majority, and if they don't satisfy everybody, they can't get it done. And then the Senate, they're 50-50. If they lose a single, so a guy Joe Manchin has become in effect, a king, because he can control the entire process.
The swing vote.
But overreach, this is one of the things that I think we can be reminded of. Not learn, because this has been the case for a very long time, but just be reminded of that overreach always backfires. It always backfires, whether it's Republicans or Democrats. And Biden and the Democrats, with their razor-thin majority in the Congress, may have overreached. They come in, initially they're talking about trillions of dollars. At one point, the Progressive Caucus, which is about 95 members of the 435 in the Congress, but this is the most liberal members, and they're talking about something like $8 trillion for social spending stuff, and then that goes down to $3.5 trillion, and now it's down to $1.75 trillion, and they still haven't been able to get an agreement on that as well. But that's what I mean by overreach, okay? And I say it happens on both sides. I remember in 2004, when George W. Bush was reelected to a second term, he beat John Kerry, and he didn't win that by a ton against John Kerry, okay? This reelection, he had the Iraq War going on, and that was weighing him down. He didn't win that by a lot. I still remember, and you'll see this written about even today sometimes, him coming out just a day after the election, maybe 2 days, holds a press conference, and he says, I've got, political capital, and I'm going to spend it. Okay, you don't got a lot of political capital. You didn't win by a whole lot, okay, number one. What are you going to spend it on? Well, it was Social Security reform. He was going to reform Social Security. He's got enough popularity, enough political capital to go after reforming Social Security. You know how long that lasted? That lasted a few months. That thing just died. It had no chance. I remember hearing it. I'm going, what? You got political capital to do that? No, that's a Republican. That's a conservative guy doing it. But it doesn't matter who it is. You overreach, there will be a backlash. You take Obama. Obama comes in 2008. Now, he won by a lot. He beat McCain by a good bit. But first thing he does is Obamacare. That's gigantic. But guess what? 2010, they get wiped out in the congressional elections. And in 2012, he did win re-election, but barely against Romney. So overreach always backfires. Lots of history with that. A Democratic congresswoman just this week from, yes, Virginia, where she's a Democrat, Republican just got elected as the governor. She said this week of Biden, no one elected him to be FDR.
Oh, wow.
She's saying that of her president and her party. No one elected you to be FDR. They just elected you to be solid and to end the chaos. And you know what?
That's pretty solid reflection.
I think that's right. I think FDR, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal, and during the 40s, the 30s and 40s, and with America in the Great Depression, and then in World War II, and all of the things and legislation that he got through. No one elected you to do that, okay? And you don't have that kind of majority. And so there's always this backlash. But they come in ready to spend more money than ever. And when I say ever, I mean ever. That's what they were trying to do. But more than the money is the social policy and overreach. We've said more than once on our podcast that there will be a backlash against some of the kind of radical social agenda going on that's going to attempt to mix bathrooms in schools. Parents are not going to stand for that. Or radical teaching really of any type, including on race and critical race theory. Now that, and I've written about this on my blog, that's kind of become the new war on Christmas. Going back years ago, Fox News was promoting there's a war on Christmas in secular society, and then Trump kept making a big deal out of saying Merry Christmas. He even said, "I saved Christmas." I saved Christmas. Okay, so this is the new war on Christmas. It's all over the place. It's something you need to be afraid of. You need to be very afraid of. Is kind of the idea. And as with everything on social media and on cable, it's overblown. But saying that it's overblown doesn't mean it's non-existent. And parents are concerned about it in the schools, and parents have a right to know what's going on in their schools. And it came up in the Virginia election at one of the debates, and the Democrat, Terry McAuliffe, said parents should not be involved in what's taught in school.
Wow.
He never recovered from that, and it's a good thing that he never recovered from that. But as you wig out about where the country's headed, remember that to every action there's a reaction. And for the last few decades, control of Congress has swung back and forth with an edge, actually, over these last few decades to the Republicans a bit.
Yeah. On another then topic, our final topic for this episode, one of our viewers asked whether or not members of Congress were involved in the insurrection attempt that we saw on January 6th.
Well, the short answer is we won't know until either the 1/6 Commission that's doing its work issues its report, or possibly they find out and it's leaked. But that report probably won't be issued until actually the summer. So we won't know for sure until one of those two things happens. But I believe there is good reason to think some were, because they were communicating. We do know this. Some members of Congress were communicating with radical right groups in the weeks and days before the riot. Some were even giving tours of the building just days before. Now, I'm going to caution here. I don't know this, so please understand, I don't know this. I suspect this. I suspect that one of the things that's going to come out is that there were plans given to some of the rioters about where to go in the building. Not just where to go inside the building, how to get inside the building, which windows, because it turns out in the Capitol there were some windows that were secured and some that were not, some that were reinforced and some that were not. So that'll be interesting to see where that goes. So, but I find it interesting and concerning that so many in Congress are vehemently opposed to finding out what happened. And that makes me suspicious that, in fact, some indeed are guilty. But on this topic of our structure holding together and how important that is, this event that took place on January the 6th is enormously, friends, dangerous. We've never had an attack on our Capitol like that in 200 years, and yet you have many who want to whitewash that, who want to deflect blame for it. Remember, as soon as it happened, hey, that's not us. That's not our side. Those are Black Lives Matters people posing as us. So you try to deflect blame for it, or let's just move on from it. I am thankful because of the need to hold structure together. I'm thankful that we have a 1/6 Commission. I am thankful that you have at least 2 Republicans who have the guts to be on that committee, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. But the very few, unfortunately, Republicans in Congress who are willing to stand up to what Trump and his friends did on January the 6th, they have all suffered backlash, and most of them are retiring. They're not running for re-election. You know who Kinzinger is. Kinzinger announced this week he is not running for re-election in 22. Now, he's a guy of courage and integrity. It's going to be a real loss not to have him in Congress. I hope he runs for higher office. He did intimate that, by the way. He said, I'm not done.
Great.
I'm not done, yeah. But meanwhile, the committee is doing a thorough job. They said that they've interviewed 150 witnesses so far. They've issued dozens of subpoenas, including for information from the former president, which, go figure, he's fighting in court. Now,
it's a witch hunt.
That's the idea. It's but so far he hasn't. The courts have not ruled in his favor on that, and some of the information from him has had to be turned over, but he's still fighting other information. One last thing on that 1/6 Commission. Just yesterday, they had scheduled a meeting, an interview with a guy named Jeffrey Clark. Jeffrey Clark was a guy who was in the Justice Department in the waning days of the Trump administration. but he was kind of down on the org chart, and Trump was looking to promote him possibly all the way up to the top. To be the Attorney General. We talked about that. Okay, Jeffrey Clark is this guy's name. Well, and the reason that Trump was really wanting to bring him up is because that guy was willing to do the bidding that others were not. And those others said, we will resign en masse if you do this. They were in the Oval Office 3 days before January 6th having this very discussion. And Jeffrey Clark was at the center of this, and he was willing to do it and urging others to go along with it. So the 1-6 committee wants to talk to him. Guess what? He doesn't want to talk to them. So just yesterday, he was scheduled to be interviewed. He went, and guess what? He pled the fifth.
Wow.
Yeah.
That
so more to come.
Good.
But I'm glad it's being looked into.
All right. Well, that was a lot to catch up on.
Yes.
Yeah. Appreciate you watching and joining us for this episode. I'll remind you, as I do regularly, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so that you know when our new episodes come out. We try to produce one every Saturday at 2 p.m. and we'll look forward to seeing you in the next one. If you have a question you'd like us to consider, you can send that in to our email address, info@cbctrenton.com, or text it to us at 97000.